Greetings all. The April Q&A, which has moved into May a bit, and I'm not sure I'm going to be quite able to keep this up to one a month, but we'll see how things go. I hope you're enjoying the Swedish series. More of that is to come. But first, I'm going to start off with the merchandising pitch. Some of you may have noticed hoodies and mugs. Yeah, that's a hoodie. I think there's sweatshirts as well. There you go, one mug in the YouTube Teespring shop below the video. In addition, you will notice that I am wearing a new t-shirt inspired by the apparently popular fire command over on the Forgotten Weapons Sherman video. There has been much debate as to the exact nature of the design, so we figured we'd just put it all up and see what sells. So they come with or without the Chieftain silhouette and the TC's hatch, and the green shirt comes in either the white or black ink to suit your preference. These are produced by Everpress and not Teespring. I've been quite happy with them in the past, and so they are available in the text link in the video description and not the YouTube merchandise shop. In order to save on shipping, and at the request of those who missed out on them the last time that they were out, the Drive Me Closer and Tank is on Fire t-shirts are available from them as well. Orders may be placed within the next 3 weeks, at which point they get closed out, printed, shipped, still with plenty of time for you to get them for the next tank event in your area once this whole virus thing lifts. And the way all the museums are scheduling, it's going to be a hell of a September. You have to sort of pick and choose which event you want to go to. Also, folks are still complaining that they are not being notified of video releases. All I can say is make sure you have the little bell icon turned on next to the subscribe button. It's the only thing I can think of. So that's the admin stuff out of the way. On to the questions, which unusually are actually basically all sensible with no magic or anything else like that. And kicking off with a popular question from Admiral Tiberius. If I could do an inside the hatch on 5 armoured vehicles that no longer exist, are scrapped, lost, etc., what would they be? Any era, any type. Happily, he did not include vehicles which still exist in that list, because that alone is going to be a very, very long list. If the Russians were ever to let me, I could spend days crawling over all those odd prototypes in Kubica, for example. So, vehicles which are lost or destroyed. I think I'm going to have to start with the Tsar tank. Now I realize that I'm immediately setting myself up for failure due to the lack of any tracked attention, but I would think the reasoning behind such a choice is self-evident. Sticking with the World War I theme, given that as people didn't really know what a tank was supposed to look like, all sorts of weird designs were being kicked around, the US steam tank. Yes, it is a World War I tank propelled by a steam engine. One can only imagine the risk of boiler explosion was part of why that never took off as an idea. 2 American vehicles which I wish had been preserved, both of them heavy tanks, the T-32 and the T-58. The T-32 because, well, basically by all accounts, was actually quite a good tank. There just didn't seem to be much of a need for it. And the T-58 because, hey, who doesn't want to check out how an auto-loading 155mm oscillating turret tank gets its track tensioned? That leaves me with just one spot left, and I can think of all sorts of vehicles, French, German, Japanese, that would have been worth taking a look at if they were still around, but I will keep it simple and with what I know, because that way I wouldn't have to make much up as I'm reviewing the vehicle. So I'll go with the T-55E1 3-inch gun motor carriage, a US attempt to make an 8x8 tank destroyer during World War II. It looks like it ought to be a hoot to drive around. And a Y-bird. Why was the Vickers 75mm high velocity not used on Centurion? Well, it seems that there was just no desire for it. The 75mm, as you mentioned in your question, was intended for Cromwell, but it just didn't fit. Then, when they built Comet to fit it into, they realized that, well, they could ease manufacturing requirements by making basically a baby 17-pounder by using the same projectiles. When Centurion came about, it was designed from the very beginning to take something the size of 17-pounder, i.e. 17-pounder, comfortably. So why would they drop it down to a smaller, less powerful gun? Alexander H. What is my opinion of exercises such as Defender 2020? Are we returning to the days of Reforger? For those who are young types, in fact that actually kind of includes me to a large extent, Reforger was the return of forces to Germany, and it was a major exercise which simulated a massive increase in tension, if not outright hostility, in the Iron Curtain, and which saw tens of thousands of troops fly across the Atlantic, as well as exercise sea lift capability and so on. The folks in the DoD are careful to state that Defender 2020, which also sees a surge of troops move into Europe, is not a return to Reforger, although I'm not entirely sure I see the major difference outside of the number of countries participating and the size. Defender 2020 is billed as the largest deployment to Europe since Reforger, which topped out at 125,000 troops back in, I think it was 89. Defender Europe 2020 is, however, a mere 20,000 men, basically a full division. So one puts things into perspective there. Now I'm going to skirt politics for a second and mention Trump. Now he is well known for being, well, shall we say, opinionated with regards to NATO defense expenditures. But it is worth noting the actual actions of the US military regardless, in that they have been doing a lot more NATO than they have in the recent past, and mainly to Eastern European nations like Poland and the Baltics. There have been routine deployments to Poland over the last few years, and oftentimes they will take their equipment with them. And these movements have been used as shakedowns for long forgotten techniques, such as offloading at a port from a ship and putting it onto a barge, and then sending the barge down the river, or up the river, as well as more traditional but still not often practiced techniques such as railheading on European rolling stock. Remember also the snap activation a couple of months ago of nearly 30 ships of the Sea Lift fleet, again the largest in years. So again, there's a lot of cobwebs that need to be dusted off here. Now of course Defender Europe 2020 has been basically nixed courtesy of coronavirus, which of course is also why you have this wonderful hairstyle. I'm sure in future years you're going to be looking back over the sequence of videos and you'll see the progression of quarantine grooming standards. I don't think we're quite at Reforger levels yet. There's just too much to relearn. So the soldiers who were privates and lieutenants in the last Reforger, where I think it was 93, are today chief warrant officers and general officers. However, the bottom line is that no matter what the DoD says, Defender Europe is designed to exercise getting a whole bunch of troops from the wrong side of the Atlantic to the right side quickly. Chase Walls. What would be the ideal tank for me to develop if I had the resources to do it? What would it look like and what would it fire, etc.? Ideally, it would be something with the capabilities of Bun Bun but weigh about 30 tons and maybe fly. More practically, if money were no object, I'd start with the track tension system from Challenger 2, and probably also the hydrogas suspension just to save room inside. Then immediately I would use up the room saved by taking the hydraulic actuations from, say, Japan or Korea to make it sit or lean, with suitable disconnects necessary for smooth riding when not actually actuating. A lack of torsion bars may also allow for an escape hatch in the floor, useful if you roll over. I'm quite happy with the turbine on the M1, and after all, we have all the resources we need for fuel supplies in this hypothetical, and trucks and all that. And I suspect that a modern turbine is going to be much less thirsty than the current nearly 5-decade-old one anyway. Top end weight limit of about 60 tons, emphasize frontal protection over side. The turret will have an autoloader, the only way to keep the weight down, and at least a 130mm cannon. Rounds will have selectable fusing. Laser warning and active protection is a must, specifically to include defense against artillery submunitions from above, see earlier Q&A. Coaxial 7.62 put the RWS with the caliber 50 behind the TC's position, more or less where the caliber 50 was on earlier Shermans. And the reason you do this is so you can actually see out. If you look where the RWS is, the crows on an M1A2 these days, it's just huge, it gets in your way. Then you take things like the individual crew station monitors from the CV90, so that, for example, the driver can see the various optics like the gun sight when he's stationary, and he can do a share of the sentry duty, or it'll just help him maneuver. And also add a reversing camera. Nick the refrigerator from the Aussies, use the extended bustle rack from the current M1s. I have no idea how British and German tankers get everything to fit into their tank ranks. Integrate the whole system with both the battlefield management system properly so that one can generally just laze and upload a target location quickly. Right now, last I checked, it was a little bit convoluted. And also integrate the system into simulator training. So basically you have a tactical exercise without movement. And if it's possible to receive feed from either drones or recon units, to display those on the internal monitors as well, and so much the better. Now, some of this I think is actually already in service. For example, the Merkava 4, I believe, will do a simulator sort of tactical exercise without movement. Now, I don't think that active thermal camouflage is rugged enough, that BAE, hey, camouflage your tank as a pickup truck sort of thing. So I think we'll just have to rely on IR netting like Barracuda to reduce the effective thermal signature. Now, this is not going to be a cheap tank, and few militaries probably could afford it, but Chase did say resources are available. Since I mentioned it, Samuel Fisher wants to know the advantages and disadvantages of the hydropneumatic suspension on Japanese tanks, and Kazuki-K does respond correctly that it's mainly to do with the mountains. In both Japan and Korea, and the K2 does have such suspension, are very mountainous countries. The Americans did play around with the system for a while, but decided it wasn't worth the effort, especially as most places that it was likely to fight would be non-mountainous anyway, and the Americans tended to build their tanks with good ranges of elevation and depression anyway. And of course, the Soviets have something of a similar suspension nature on the BMDs, although mainly that's just to squish the vehicle down so that it'll fit on the airplane. Outside of S-Tank, which is kind of its own special case, the first major tank to use such a suspension I can think of would be the Type 74. Now, as mentioned, if there are steep slopes, the ability to kneel down means that there is the possibility of shooting lower down a slope with the accompanying survival advantages. So because the suspension on this doesn't work so well, and it's very fragile, this is metal. Imagine you're on the reverse slope of a mountain and you want to shoot down, and the gun will only go down 10 degrees. Well, you can't shoot down far enough. So if you lower the front of the tank, you can now shoot down the hill. Now, it also means that one could aim up more, up in the hillsides, but if you're in such a situation that you need to do that, you're probably better off leaving and going somewhere else. Now, the Type 74 is still basically also a second generation tank, and the fire control system is going to be a bit limited. I am not sure how good the cant correction is on a Type 74, but it would not surprise me to discover that fire control is far more accurate if the hull and thus the turret are level and not tilted to one side. So, cant is basically when you're on a side slope. So you're shooting like this, and you're now tilted. And what happens is, as you super elevate the gun to effect for range, because you're tilted, you're now also aiming off to one side. So hence you need to correct the cant. Now, modern fire control systems do automatically account for cant, although usually there is still a limit of about 20 or 24 degrees that they can offset for. So as a result, K2, Type 74, can lean to one side. So if you're on a side slope, you level out. Makes the fire control system have a much easier time of it, and likely increases the amount of side slope that your tank can engage with. And finally, the tank can just lower itself to the ground to reduce the silhouette, but the suspension will have to be very carefully designed to maintain the tension if they were to try moving in the lowered position. Sofa Mods asks, what are my favorite design features or entire tanks which, though promising, interesting, cool, etc., were, alas, too pure for the world and had to be taken out behind a shed? Driver in turret, such as an Object 416 or MBT 70, is the obvious thought. Saved a lot of space inside the hull, but gave the driver motion sickness. And frankly, it also took space inside the turret, of course. A 40-ton Burt of the GAU 8 mounted on a tank chassis would have been cool, and indeed, of course, there were such proposals. The tanks of HL Yo were innovative, to say the least, such as having the engine in the turret for some reason. I don't know what the explanation was, but I think that one truly did deserve to be taken out behind a shed. Or better yet, put up against a wall as an example to others. As an aside, it seems that the HLO company is now a personnel management company, and their archives have absolutely nothing about their tank making days. I rather confused the hell out of them when I gave them a call. I think liquid propellant for artillery deserves another look, but I don't think it would work for tanks. Thermal screening by way of an outer skin was an interesting idea, but I think really only the 2T Stalker or the AMX-30 Stealth really tried to show it off, if they even actually used it. The idea is that one circulates ambient air in the gap in between the inner and outer skins, the inner skin being the main armor plate. But there are easier ways of solving the problem. And while I'm bringing it, the 2T, the Stalker, it always reminds me of the XM-10 Annihilator tank with the kind of pop-out missiles in odd shape. Then again, the North Koreans have taken missile craziness to new tank levels. I'm sure there are plenty of other ideas, but they aren't immediately coming to mind. Now, he also asks if I think the poor old Bradley deserves its awful reputation. Now, this is, of course, where one references the movie Pentagon Wars, which is actually a little bit more accurate than one might think. If you look at the various drawings of the plans of the vehicle in the famous improvement sequence where he keeps going to the generals and they keep asking for changes, you'll actually find similar pre-Bradley vehicles that would be found in the Fort Benning Museum collection, like the XM723. And Bradley's history really is a case of mission creep caused by funding shortages. However, one may also question the underlying premise as to whether or not Bradley actually does have a poor reputation. And I don't think you're going to find many folks who crewed Bradleys, and that includes myself, who actively dislike them. Now, as with many vehicles, it's a compromise. I think it's a little bit big for a Scout, and it does have that annoying plume of exhaust from here that kind of, when it sneaks around in and out of position, a big huge exclamation point going, he's here. But, as I have mentioned before, scouting is not the only role of US cavalry vehicles, unlike a lot of other nations where Scouts only do scouting. So the multi-role capability does require those compromises, and something the size of a Fennec or a CVRT is not going to be doing cover missions. It is true that there is a bit of a dilemma as to how close to keep a Bradley to troops, because the troops have their short range and the Bradley has a long range, but I am sure by now the infantry have sorted that out. The Bradleys are getting a little long in the tooth, and the Army acknowledges this with an upgrade program. However, I found them to be plenty reliable enough. The cannon is very good for the time, and it's a hoot to shoot. The missile system is sensibly installed, and if you put a block under the back ramp, when you put it down, it's horizontal, it is a great sleeping spot. For an IFV from the early 80s, it really isn't bad at all, and it has given nearly 4 decades of good service. Now, I would definitely take the tank over the Bradley if I was given a choice, but I was quite happy with the time I had in the Bradley as well. Hugo U. If I could make any one change to a tank, what would it be? It's an interesting question. I shall stick with the M1 since I know it. New engine, bigger gun, better track tension system? No, I'm going to go with an air conditioner. I'm confident that most of the other things will be fixed by the Army over time. Air conditioning, I'm not so sure. Time Bomb 757. In Q&A number 9, look, people are paying attention to these things. I mentioned that I didn't see MBT design shifting dramatically to be better suited to urban combat, but would I see more heavy fighting vehicles like BMPT or Nagmatron, which seem to be geared specifically towards city fighting? Actually, I'm not sure they really are. It is certainly true that a vehicle like BMPT is indeed very well suited for city fighting, but I am led to understand that the design requirements for it actually predate the experiences of the Russian army in Grozny. It is an interesting question, but when you consider just how complicated the urban fight is, I'm not sure that these big vehicles are going to be a great solution either. You can't exactly crawl through sewers in them, for example. Now, I am a little bit out of the loop of the rifleman world, but I strongly suspect that dollars going towards increasing infantry capabilities is going to provide a better return on investment than heavy armored vehicles. And we're talking about small things like unmanned ground vehicles, throwable cameras, designators, robot crabs, wall penetrating sensors, delayed fused shoulder fired rockets, things like that. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't turn away a BMPT if one happened to show up and say, hey, I'm going to give you a hand, but I'm not sure it really makes the relative priority requirements and dollar values. As for Nagmatron, I have not actually encountered any particular information that you haven't. Caleb Engelhart. With today's technology, would it be possible to make the super heavy vehicles like Mouse and T-28 reliable and with reasonable performance? With the 1945 specifications of armour and gun, absolutely. I mean, have you seen the size of some of these mining vehicles? But there is a reason that even today we don't have 100-ton tanks, let alone 180-ton tanks. As for the return in the future of diesel-electric hybrid systems for power, yes, I've covered these, I think, in a previous Q&A, but there are three reasons basically why hybrid systems are still being looked at. One is fuel efficiency. One is the tremendous torque that the motors can come out with, especially from the start. And one is the possibility of running silent, which is useful for recon vehicles. I think we're some way away yet from proper tanks with hybrid drives, but I would not be incredibly surprised to see lighter hybrid vehicles entering military service maybe by the end of the decade. Robert Henry Ilston. I have talked of my joy in finding the World War II anti-tank ROC documents, but beyond that, what are my top 5, say what, moments when doing research which have led me down the rabbit hole? Well, none really. The problem with the US National Archives is that they're basically a mess. Just because I come across something that results in, well, this would be interesting for me to look into more, there usually is no clue as to where to continue looking. So I either find it or I don't. I've seen test reports for bicycles, Zerby's steam pipe tank destroyer I mentioned before, various hover jeeps, tests of things down to the smallest components like a slew of fuel pumps to choose from on the Sherman. At this point, I don't think anything was going to truly surprise me. But even though I've often encountered things that I would love to look into further, I'm just not normally able to start. Adam Schindler. Instead of mounting all the infantry into big heavy Bradleys, which don't carry many troops, would it be better to separate out troops into Humvees versus smaller, more heavily armoured fighting vehicles? So basically you're talking about tanks travelling with soft skins, maybe M113s or other such vehicles, and I think by now that has been generally discarded as a concept. Firstly, because the enemy is just going to shoot at the troop carriers and kill more troops per shot anyway. Secondly, you just know that wherever you put the IFVs, that's where you want the troops, and vice versa. Thirdly, you're just increasing your manpower and fuel needs even more to increase the number of vehicles which are going to contribute less to the fight. I'm just not really seeing the benefit. Charles Charange. Would the US have been more or less prepared for World War II if anyone other than Barnes had been the head of R&D? Now, I don't think there's very much argument that Barnes wasn't an engineering genius. I may refer to him as the Army's mad scientist, and he certainly had flaws, but almost every mad scientist is a flawed genius. And not only was he a worthy engineer in his own right, but he also was evidently capable of running the department. Engineers don't always excel in technical and administrative and leadership skills. Now, I do not subscribe to the belief that any general was irreplaceable, so maybe a non-Barnes would be more willing to compromise with the end user and avoid the Ordnance Army Ground Forces infighting. Or maybe he would have developed a that instead of a this. And one can say the same about Bill Knudsen, who basically geared up national industry to become the powerhouse of weapons and supply production that the US turned itself into. It's almost impossible to think of anyone even better, but just because these guys who existed did such fantastic jobs does not mean that other people might not have done as well, albeit perhaps differently. They did. Well, really that's enough. Now, I'm going to make mention of, here it is, Paul Kennedy wrote a book, Engineers of Victory, and it's all about those behind the scenes guys that developed something that was amazing. So Knudsen's in there, the bloke who decided to stick the Merlin into the P-51 was is in there. Now, those unsung heroes that you really want to pay attention to. Anyway, Joe Holloway, what is Canadian Pot Sabot and how is it different to other Sabot rounds? Surprisingly difficult question to get a solid answer to, but here's as best as I understand it. Canadian Sabot is, as the term implies, a Canadian design, which appears to have been developed entirely differently to British developments. It shows up as approved, basically, is finalized in 1946, just after the war, and is particularly notable for being more accurate than the British designs. The British 17-pounder Sabot accuracy I've gone over before, but the Canadian munitions did not suffer from the same problems, and indeed the Americans eventually used the Canadian design in its first in-service Sabot round, the 76mm HVAP DS M331, as used in the M41 Walker Bulldog. Not to be confused with the M331 HEP round, by the way. So that's the that, now the why. The round was developed by the Artillery Proof and Development Establishment in Valcartier, Quebec, with initial test firings actually happening as early as 1943. If you look at the British and Canadian rounds side by side, you'll see that they are both cup-type sabots as opposed to modern ring sabots. And certainly you will note that the British Sabot encloses more of the projectile, and there are differences on the after end, but the actual primary difference lies in the separation mechanism. The British Sabot petals are centrifugally separated, and you can see how the Sabot is sectioned and how after the round has left the muzzle, the three pieces just fly off, given the round is spinning. The Canadian Sabot's primary design criterion is to not interfere with muzzle brakes, and so they have a pot, also known as a deep cup design. And you'll see no sectioning. The Sabot is a single piece. It's literally a cup that the projectile is in. As the round flies downrange, drag alone causes the Sabot to fall behind the projectile, thus creating a separation. Now, this is a lot more difficult than it sounds, because the US had been testing these pot sabots as early as 1942 and just couldn't get the Sabot and the projectile to separate without causing the projectile to tumble. They gave up and moved to the British system of centrifugal separation for future rounds, which I've covered in the last two Q&As ago and also never entered service. But the Canadians solved the problem, and there were two tricks they used. The first was to give the projectile a little bit of freedom of movement to allow some yaw before the separation was completed. And as an aside, for engineering or physics reasons I do not understand, some yaw was considered beneficial in armor-piercing rounds at the time and was specifically sought after. Again, I don't understand it, but that's what the reports say. So this is part of the reason why the Sabot is shorter than on the British round. The other trick that they used was that they used a small gas chamber created in the base of the Sabot, which trapped propellant gases and aided in the separation. Now, the Americans had actually figured out the second part, but not perfected it. The Canadians did. So that's the why. The last question, the answer to which I do not know, is why not? Given that the Canadians had solved the problem, why didn't the British use the design themselves? And my only offering, and it's purely personal speculation, is that the British had, by the time Pot Sabot was accepted for use, already built a substantial stockpile of domestic Sabot rounds and weren't about to just chuck them away. Again, an accuracy deficiency did remain with the British compared to the Canadian rounds until at least the mid-1950s, when the last Sabot sleeve modification was issued for updating any projectiles that remained in storage. On that note, there were a couple of comments on the previous Q&A that APDS rounds for the 6-pounder were on issue with the US and Western Europe. While I'm going to back episodes, Mr. Les Berg, who was a Bradley turret mechanic, has confirmed my theory that the tow missile system is electric. TN Sheep. Pastime sports I like to play that are not gun related. None. I don't have the time anymore. Or the money. I used to fly light aircraft, but at 140 an hour wet rate, it's a very expensive hobby, so I've not flown in years. I used to be part of a car club in California, known as the Quattro Crew. Officially, suppose, Audi drivers. Unofficially, well, VAG cars are all welcome. in reality, we didn't give a damn as long as you liked horsepower, so it would show up with anything from Astons to Alphas. Then you'd find a nice quiet country road out in a county that we had reason to believe that the one sheriff's deputy on duty that morning was on the other side of the county, and then just go for a drive. I've done Laguna Seca and an open wheeler. I like cars. Well, actually, face it, if you go between tanks, airplanes, cars, trains, I guess I just like motors. Modeling, well, you guys are aware of. I spend a lot of time, probably too much time on the computer playing games, and occasionally tabletop wargaming if I ever find opponents. And I guess it's possible that part of the reason that I'm still a major is that I don't play golf. Realistically, the closest that I'm ever going to get to an outdoor sport in the near future is the 20-yard dash, when my 2-year-old is about to do something questionable and or expensive. Which now brings us to the gun of the month. And today's gun of the month is the Israel weapons industry from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Tavor X95. I have always been a bit of a fan of bullpups, and indeed the first rifle I ever purchased in the US was a bullpup. It was a Bushmaster M17S. In hindsight, that purchase may have been a mistake, and I actually it turned out to be the first rifle I ever sold, and also the last rifle I've ever sold, now I think about it. And it's kind of interesting how years of development can apply themselves to what is fundamentally still a very, very old technology. I mean, the basic principles of this thing, hey, you're familiar with from all sorts of semi-automatic rifles, but a lot of the quirks have been solved in the X95. And some of them are just elegant solutions. So for example, on the M4 carbine, if you wanted to change out the handguards so you can mount rails for whatever it was you wanted to mount, it's a little bit annoying to do. I mean, it's not too difficult, but it's a little annoying. But they solved it on the X95 by just having these little sort of slide off panels that you can slide off from the top or the bottom, or wherever the hell they are. Here you go, at the bottom. So if I do decide for some reason I want to put stupid amounts of things onto this rifle and make it even heavier, I can do so very, very simply. Similarly, as I put this back in, should I wish to, the backup iron sights are actually integrated as part of the Picatinny mounting. The magazine release, well, now it's located up front and it is ambidextrous, so should you be left-handed, you may use the left side release. Now you will have to beforehand probably change out the bolt ejection, but whatever. Balance, well, I've always liked the balance on bullpups, and the point of balance on this is right around here when the rifle is empty. I mean, the ergonomics of it are fine. I like the fact that it does have a hold open release. It's a little bit inconvenient to get to, but at least you can do it. So pull it down, push out, and your bolt is stuck in place. Cleaning it is a little bit annoying because you have this huge plastic case that the rifle isn't. Now, I mean, removing the action is actually very easy. You just fold down the butt plate and move it out. If I were to say that there is a flaw that I haven't yet seen suitably solved with a bullpup, it's the lack of an adjustable stock. But I strongly suspect that's only a matter of time. I mean, just not looking in the right places. This is the only rifle that I had which I could not convert from California legal to Free State legal. And when I got it, it was, California had these mag releases were removed. There was a secondary mag release back here, and it came with a muzzle brake to increase the overall length to meet the California minimum requirement. With the muzzle brake installed, the thing had no recoil at all. Wonderful. It's a little bit more now with the normal flash suppressor, but this is a lovely firearm to shoot, I have to say. The trigger, people complain about bullpup triggers. It's not a bad bullpup trigger, it really isn't. And I'm told that there are replacements that you can do to make the trigger even better. For a combat rifle, this is fine. I'm not shooting this thing at 1,000 yards in marksmanship competitions. You can see I put a strike fire for Vortex and a flip to side magnifier. The reason I picked Vortex on this is Vortex do a hell of a military discount, if you weren't aware of it. So that is basically the gun of the month. So we'll see what we get next time. So X-10-5, affordable, reliable, a pleasure to shoot. Let's move on to something bigger. And no, IWI have not paid me to plug it. Right, back to the tank questions. Kazuki K with the traditional twofer. What contingencies did the NATO allies have for the use of tanks in the event of a post-nuclear battlefield? Soviet doctrine revolved heavily around the assumption of a hot battlefield, and their tanks were equipped to fight closed hatch. Not just for the NBC environment, they fight closed hatch ordinarily as well. And yes, the TC does have some gadgets to help them out. And I did make an error in the T55 video. One of the buttons on the TC's viewing handles up here, it's actually a sort of a crude slew to my target override. I must remember to edit that description actually in the video. However, there is a small failure in the assumption of the second part of the question that you wrote, that NATO tanks don't receive as much support for closed operations, and that, for example, a 1983 Abrams TC would just be stuck with his vision blocks. Now, fortunately, NATO tanks are nice and big, and it would be theoretically possible, presumably you get some advance notice, to live in the thing's closed hatch for a day or three. 24-hour exercises in full MOP, i.e. chem suits, were never particularly popular, and the director of the Swedish Tank Museum, who was involved in the selection process between Leopard and well, what ended up being Leopard, made mention of the fact that if there was any test that the Abrams clearly beat the Leopard 2 in, it was the livability test for 24 hours closed down. Now, I seem to recall, if you can track down, there's an old book called Chieftains, which, if memory serves, was written by a former Chieftain crewman, and there's a segment in there where they end up doing just this, and you get some of his opinions. As for the American tanks, excepting the M60A2, which did have a hunter-killer system, yes, they do lack the independent periscope as found on, for example, Leopard, but they also have a very big rotating cupola with a weapons system. So in the M1, the commander's weapons system is equipped with a by-3 optic. The M60's M85 would have its own optic as well. Plus, the cupola has its own independent traverse, so the large vision block, or magnified, but large for good angle, is usable while scanning, and the loader's periscope similarly is fully rotating, albeit also not magnified. So they're not entirely blind, and well, they're reasonably comfortable. Now, it happened that Eli Watson had a very similar question and wondered if the US crew would consider fighting head out for vision in full MOP. Now, basically wearing absolutely everything, the mask and so on. I don't think so, and mainly because you'll be leaving a serious decontamination problem for the tank interior if you fight with hatch open, and I don't think the NBC overpressure is going to do it. As for the second question, again Panther related, there was some amusement over the timelines. Germany invades Russia. They meet 14.5mm anti-tank rifles. They then produce Panther, and it is suddenly discovered to their shock and horror that it is vulnerable to anti-tank rifles, and so they develop Panther 2 and then Schutzen. How did they manage to screw that up? Why not just make Panther tough enough to begin with? Well, both sides ballsed up actually. After the Russians developed the Rukavishnikov PTR-39 semi-automatic 14.5mm anti-tank rifle in 1939, they concluded that the most likely opponents were actually going to be the Germans, and that the German tanks were going to be so heavily armored there wasn't any point in anti-tank rifles, so they just didn't bother. Then they went and invaded Poland, and they had a rather nasty experience at the receiving end of Polish 7.9mm Model 35s, of which they then came into possession of quite a number. Then, when the Germans invaded, due to the lack of anything else, these Model 35s were used, and maybe some PTR-39s, and it was discovered, kind of, holy crap, these things actually work. Quick, let's build our own. Hence the crash production of the PTRD and PTRS, of which under 20,000 were made in late 1941. So, the German experience of anti-tank rifles is mainly of the smaller type and maybe a few of the larger, but not enough really to worry about. Now, the Soviets turned up the taps in 1942, making nearly 250,000 of the things, but that's kind of in the future. Now, let's hop over the border to Germany. They are trying to make this new tank, and they're starting to encounter these new 14.5mm rifles. Perhaps they capture a few and test them with the ammo they have, or maybe they do what wargamers do now and they look up the manuals. Okay, let's see. There aren't really enough to totally worry about, but just in case, let's B-32 armor-piercing ammunition, let's say 3.4 centimeter penetration. Okay, we'll make the armor 4 centimeter thick. We'll be sorted. And that is the side hull specification for both the MAN and the DB designs in February of 1942. Now, perhaps even at this point, there are some voices in the background kind of going, hello, actually there are reports of this new tungsten cord ammunition as well as these new rifles, the BS-41. But then you get Uncle Adolf coming along, throwing requirements like, maybe 6 centimeters of glacis armor isn't enough. Let's make it 8. And if you can make it 10, even better. The engineers are probably going along, seriously? I mean, we designed this at 35 tons, and now you're including all sorts of requirements to bring this thing up to 45 tons? And you can imagine the attitudes to the folks saying that 4 centimeters of side armor might actually not be enough to stop the anti-tank rifles. I mean, how much more weight do you want to add? So the Panthers will just have to go into battle with 4 centimeters, and we will cross the anti-tank rifle problem when we have to deal with it. Now, that's not to say that the Germans were completely ignoring the problem. Of course, in 1942, the thing's being turned out in ridiculous numbers, the rifles of course, and they seem to be surprisingly effective. So what if 4 centimeters actually isn't enough? So before the first Panther is even built, they start designing Panther 2 with 6 centimeters of side armor, which will definitely be enough to stop the PTRDs and PTRSs. Simultaneously, the Germans have also developed Schürzen, testing it as early as April 1943. So it wasn't an entire shock to the Germans that the 14.5s proved to be a threat to Panther, but it seems likely that normal development inertia and maybe some intelligence time lags prevented them from being a bit faster about dealing with the problem. Virginia artilleryman, and I owed you this from a long time ago, I'm sorry. He was wondering how tanks were operated in the indirect fire role. Did they require the support of a fire direction center to provide a firing solution, or were the crews trained to calculate it for themselves? Now today, of course, is the purview of the arcane arts of master gunners. The typical tanker doesn't learn that sort of thing. Now, I am not well versed in the arcane arts of indirect fire, but I highly recommend that you chew on an older copy of FM 17-12, such as the 1957 manual. That particular one has some 25 pages of indirect fire information. Now, there are 3 different types really of indirect fire which could be done. The first is sort of closer to a semi-indirect. So what you're doing is you're hiding just behind an obstacle, but you lay onto the target as if you were normally laying on in a direct fire mode. So the arc of flight of the round would naturally take the round upward, just barely clear the obstacle, and then land on the far side. And you could use this for dealing with bunkers and the like. The second possibility is if the platoon is doing its own firework. The field manual indicates that there is an aiming circle on issue with aiming stakes, and that the tank platoon sorts itself out and sends out its own OP. However, it does observe that because the platoon lacks a fire direction center, it is highly advised that the observer be as close to the gun target line as possible, as it makes figuring out adjustments a whole hell of a lot easier. The third possibility is if the tank platoon is seconded to an artillery unit, in which case the artillery unit's fire direction center will take care of much of the difficult bit. For self-directed tank platoon fires, they are normally harassment or pre-planned because, well, Tankers are going to be figuring out everything with the aid of azimuth indicators, elevation quadrants, and lots of charts. Probably best to let the experts deal with the immediate calls for fire. Use of tanks in indirect fire was not so common in World War II, but it was not by any means also unusual a tasking for tank destroyers who were supposed to be trained on it before leaving the US. Not always, there are a few units shipped out with a waiver, but they were supposed to. The 105mm Shermans that you mentioned in the question were normally used in the direct fire role, being designated as assault guns. With only one gun per company, going through the whole hassle of setting up for indirect fire just probably wasn't worth the hassle. There was apparently some question as to how things were really done in the field, regardless of doctrine, and the matter was certainly given some attention to the folks asking the TD battalions from Anzio their after-action questions. Normally, when used as such, the TDs were subordinated to Divardi, and the surveys were done by the artillery units, or at the very least the artillery units would make a place mark from which the TDs would then take over. With only one notable exception, the TDs were, again, quite happy to let the folks whose primary job it was to do such things actually do it, even if they had their own qualified personnel to do it within the unit. And I'm fairly sure that Divardi were happier to have professionals do it as well. That said, the 701st Tank Destroyer Battalion was known for being able to do this on its own survey, mainly because they just did it so much, albeit they were simple ones. RAFI 1. Why did Soviet tanks decide to accept limited gun depression? Well, mainly because it didn't seem to be particularly necessary for what they needed. Depression is handy when you're sitting around behind hills waiting to defend against the enemy, but Soviet doctrine wasn't really very big on sitting around waiting to be attacked. Instead, smaller targets would be preferred, which also means lighter tanks. And there's also a slew of other benefits varying from increased mobility to easier bridging support. Again, I've gone over this. If you did expect to be attacked by NATO tanks, well, that's why you have swarms of anti-tank missiles and anti-tank missile vehicles and so on. And the tank units could be used for counterattack. It's another example of different tank designs not being directly comparable because they had different purposes in mind. Well, the designers did when they were being designed. Juuso Alonen. Are there any tanks, or interesting variants of other vehicles, that I've come across that may have existed at some point but can't say for sure due to lack of evidence? Odd photos, anecdotal evidence, and so on. One which immediately comes to mind is the Canadian Ram with the 3-inch gun, to which I have seen reference in the archives, so I'm fairly sure they made it. But as to what it actually is, nobody seems to know. Could have been the Canadian version of the M10. That would make sense. Or maybe it was the Ram with the 3.7-inch gun, but the .7 got dropped in the typing. Another famous one is the T-34 with the 8.8cm gun. Now, it's pretty much agreed by everybody, I think, at this point, that there was no tank where they just dismounted the 85 and stuck the 88 in the turret instead. There is some debate as to whether or not a T-34 got turned into a self-propelled mounting by removing the turret and adding the mount. There is a photoshopped image going around of what it might look like, but no actual photo exists. Now, I've been around long enough to know that almost anything is possible, and that the Germans were kind of desperate. Never underestimate the ingenuity of soldiers, and even on the Allied side, some various oddities would show up. Usually, the closest thing to your question is things which I know for sure did exist, but we don't seem to have a bloody photograph of it. Or worse, the photograph is of low quality and of limited use. And, well, just nobody's entirely sure what to make of some of the photographs, like the Japanese super heavy tank turret that got turned into a fixed fortification, supposedly. Ra W. How easy or difficult is it for a loader to load the gun when the tank is in motion? Approximately how rough can the terrain be? How fast can the tank be moving before the loader cannot load the gun? Do mechanical contrivances like indexing the gun at a loading angle or autoloaders help the situation? It's a good question. I'm not sure I can give a viable response. It is very rare that anyone actually tries to load rounds when the tank is going off-road at a good clip. If you look at almost any gunnery video, the tank is always driving along a trail. Partly for safety and partly to make sure that they don't accidentally run over some target lifters, which are very expensive. And not infrequently, they're also at a relatively slow speed because you don't want to get to the end of the trail before the engagement sequence is over. Slinging rounds while the tank is going over rough ground at high speed is surprisingly rare. In World War II, the rounds were small and shots were normally taken from the halt anyway. You were more worried about trying to grab rounds from outside or below the turret ring in the hope that the gunner didn't traverse at an unfortunate moment. However, if you were going to trundle along, suspension of the vehicle would be a factor, with the quality of the suspension varying between each vehicle and obviously also throwing you around. If you're standing and not seated, you also have to be worried about being thrown off balance. So if you're holding a heavy round, you likely can't suddenly reach out to stabilize yourself if you hit a knock. So an additional point of contact, such as sitting down, is going to be very useful. Then you have the matter of chasing the breech. So if the tank is being thrown around, the stabilizer is going to be bouncing the breech up and down. Now with a vertically sliding breech block, it's not quite so much of a problem because you can kind of aim high and then let gravity and breech movement help align the round before you shove it in. But I would still assume that an indexed loading angle, such as you find on Leopard 2 or Challenger 2, would make it easier for the loader since he knows where to aim by muscle memory. Indexed positions also help when the gun is a very high limited depression or elevation, so you're not having to fight gravity and limited space and, between the breech and the roof, for example. Philip Schneider. How is a tank tactically best used in a modern counterinsurgency conflict? The use of the tank in counterinsurgency has been in some development over the last 30 years, so I'd say, and I would include peacekeeping in this discovery, such as Somalia and former Yugoslavia. The traditional view of many years has generally been that tanks are not of great use in counterinsurgency or peacekeeping. Ultimately, these are perception and opinion campaigns, not traditionally military ones. And tanks do have a sort of an inbuilt personal separation between the troops doing the counterinsurgency and the people. However, it does turn out that they have some specific uses. So for starters, they have a very immediate psychological peacekeeping effect. We discovered that insurgents are perfectly willing to take a crack at a Bradley, but they have to be very determined before shooting at a tank. When a tank showed up, it suddenly became peaceful. And that's probably the single biggest use of the tank, as Overwatch, in a very specific statement that we care. For events where the opposition were actually determined enough to shoot at the tank, well, that's what urban kits like Tusk are for. Now, interestingly, some technological limitations of the tank became evident in these campaigns, so spotlights are coming back. The Danish figured this out with their Leopard 1s. For a deterrent to work, the people that you want to be deterred have to know that they need to be deterred. If they decide, let's say, to sneak up on a tank at night, they may not realize that the tank sees them because maybe it's dark. But if they have thermal imagers, the tank certainly should see them. So how do you let these guys know that they're being watched and they should behave? Turn on a searchlight. Illuminate them. Now, on the other hand, night vision, like image intensifiers, are a serious problem. So apparently when they were developing the M1, for example, I haven't looked up the records, but I'm going to assume this is so, there seems to have been some foolish assumption that nobody would be driving around the battlefield with their lights on. So the driver's night vision at the time was an image intensifier, as was the PVS-14 that the tank commander might be using. But in a counterinsurgency with civilian activity, the supposition just does not apply. So you can be driving down the road, somebody else will drive around the corner, their headlights are on, and suddenly the driver and the TC are now completely blind. The gunner's fine, but he's not driving. And I strongly suspect that this is part of the cause of the replacement of the driver's night vision on the M1 with a thermal imager. Minion. I have no clue. If I find out, I'll let you know. On to Jesse. I had mentioned that the NBC system was never used because it had a chance of catching fire. Tell me more. Well, it's a case that we were told not to use it outside of an actual NBC environment, so we didn't. We actually didn't look much into the details. I mean, what we did was what the -10 told us to do, those checks, and then we left it alone. There are those who say that there was actually no threat as long as the checks were carried out and that the fires were the result of people not following the manual. Entirely possible. It would not be the first time that the Army overreacts, and as I say, I never dug into the details. The only downside really was that the NBC system is the closest thing you have to an air conditioning system, and we went around without that. General Hogue, the difference between front and rear sprocket drive, and I'm going to reserve that also, I'm starting to get quite a collection, for a future video, as it is something which often gets asked. Matthew Lesich, what are my thoughts on Girls und Panzer? Good, mindless entertainment. I think what attracted my attention was an early sequence inside the M3 Medium, which placed the driver correctly sitting astride the transmission, which I thought was a fascinating piece of evidence for attention to detail. And as you watch it more and more, you realize that the production team are genuine tank enthusiasts, and I confirmed this by subsequently actually meeting the people. Other than that, I actually don't have many thoughts. I mean, I recommend it. Just remember, it's a bloody cartoon, not a historical documentary. Jackson Fox. How effective were tracks and sandbags as add-on armour? In terms of protection, well, I guess they were technically better than not having it, normally. Now, there were occasionally issues with the protection, then normalising shells, pointing it straight at the armour, or maybe adding standoff range for shaped charge rounds. The other problem, of course, is that the additional weight of these additional things affect mobility and reliability, as well as the question of whether or not it actually made a practical as opposed to a theoretical difference. So a Panther's 7.5 would likely go through the front of a Sherman if it had tracks or if it did not have tracks, for example. Can a machine gun damage tracks? Well, yeah, in theory, especially for earlier vehicles like maybe Panzer I. In practice, though, it seems very unlikely that you could possibly cause enough practical damage to a track to make anything negative happen, especially today. Did the M18 see any benefit from its speed tactically, or was it just operational? Well, mainly it was operational. Remember, the purpose of the TD is to be able to quickly move to a point of penetration. That speed was also found to be of use by cavalry units because it meant that something with a big gun was capable of keeping up with the lighter vehicles. General Groh of 6 Armoured was glowing in his praise of the M18 for doing logistical convoy escort. Apparently he had a problem with the Germans infiltrating his supply lines and shooting up convoys, and a couple of M18s apparently were well suited for dealing with the problem. Opinions overall varied on the type of fighting being done. 3rd Army was willing to sacrifice armour for speed, but 1st Army, which was going up against more entrenched opposition, preferred to have more armour. If you think about the tactical side though, the speed is going to be limited mainly by crew factors. For example, there is a maximum speed that you can go in any particular terrain while still having the ability to stop quickly if, say, you crest a hill or bash through a bush, only to discover that there's a great big ditch on the far side. Or similarly, you also want to avoid moving too quickly into the sights of anything with a caliber beginning with a 2 or bigger. Still, there are occasional mentions where the flotation or speed was appreciated. How effective was the M16 MGMC in World War II, and would something of the sort be useful against the new threat of drones today? Well, apparently it's quite effective against anything aircraft it's shot at. Unfortunately, since normally they turn out to be American aircraft, this was something of a problem. Also, they were very effective against North Koreans and Chinese, especially when the gun shield was mounted. See my M16 video. I would think that currently lasers and microwave technology is probably better for dealing with small drones, and not least because they literally are light speed weapons that are easy to hit and you don't get much time to aim on a drone target. Easy0896. What made the M60A2's gun launcher so problematic? Well, at least the shock of firing the conventional rounds wasn't quite as hostile to the missile guidance system's vacuum tubes as it was on Sheridan, but a lot of the problems did carry over from the one onto the other. For example, the minimum range of the missile was supposedly longer than the maximum range of the conventional round. There were a number of issues with breech sealing and with the missile alignment key damaging the barrel. The gun was stabilized, missile system was not. There were, I believe, also electrical problems found in damp climates like Germany in winter. So that brings us now to an end of the next Q&A. Hooray! My voice is already going on me. Not least because this actually took a hell of a lot of takes, which I've edited out, and you've no idea how much time I've wasted. Such is the problem. Incidentally, I asked Drakenfell about his 5.5-hour Q&A. Yeah, he has realized the error of his ways. God bless him, I wouldn't do it. Well, I probably would if I made the same commitment that he had, but I wouldn't want to. So that is, anyway, the Q&A. A modeling video, I don't know, maybe if I actually have time right now. It's been a hell of a couple of weeks. Failing that, well, I'm back to the Swedish vehicles next Saturday, so I will see you live online then. Hope you found the Q&A interesting and informative. Buy the merch. See you on the next video.